The Orioles' combination of trickery, ferocity, and skill won them 3 National League pennants during the 1890s. Their rivals, the Boston Bean Eaters, took 5. Baltimore and Boston were wildly successful, but the two teams so overwhelmed their competition that baseball crowds dwindled dangerously for those clubs in other cities that never seemed to rise above 11th or 12th place. To many fans, the long season, one of the game's great strengths, now seemed pointless. Then a national depression cut further into profits, and the owners slashed players' salaries. Clergymen and the newspapers denounced the rowdyism and scandal that followed the game everywhere, and the owners seemed incapable of doing anything. By the end of the 19th century, the professional game was in trouble.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get this show on the road, shall we? How are you, friends? Tim Hanlon here, reporting for duty, your doctor of defunct, your reverend of relocation, whatever you want to call me. It's time once again for our favorite little conclave that we like to do each and every week for you here on the big internet podcast extravaganza. We call it Good Seats Still Available. Yes, the curious little podcast, not so little anymore, actually, that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you tremendously for finding us and downloading us, sharing us, streaming us, putting us in your earbuds, whatever you're doing to listen and enjoy, hopefully, this week's episode. Now, stick with me on this one, all right? So that clip sets the tone, and it sounds like, hey, we're going to get into moldy, oldie baseball. Well, a little bit, but kind of backhandedly. And here's the entree. So as you probably can imagine, yours truly gets a ton of great new movies and books and all that kind of stuff in the realm of sports and related, with a lot of pitches on potential storylines and stuff for future episodes. And Lord knows it's a narrow focus we have, right? So we've carved out this little trench of a niche for ourselves, and to the chagrin and to the consternation, I guess, of publicity people in the publishing world out there. We have to say no to a lot more things than we say yes to. But we do our best to squint hard and try to get into some really intriguing and sometimes oft forgotten, but also maybe not even fully known or first time discovered little crevices of history. And this was the case when I received a book called From Football to Soccer, The Early History of the Beautiful Game in the United States by Professor Brian Bunk at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, published by the University of Illinois Press. And, on the cover, there's a really, really old picture. I want to say it's from the maybe 19-teens, maybe 1920s, looking very much like sort of the stereotypical ethnic sort of play of the sport, which most people can imagine and understand, even if you're not a soccer fan or with any knowledge of soccer, was, largely the predominant manner and reason, frankly, for any kind of professional expression of soccer in this country for a long, long, long time, maybe arguably until maybe the late 1960s, when, let's call it the modern version of pro soccer, which we've talked about on a number of different episodes, kind of got going after a surprisingly successful 1966 World Cup beamed live to the United States television audience for the first time. But as you can imagine, a book like this is, seemingly very focused on the very earliest vestiges of the sport. And we've kind of hinted at things like the American Soccer League, which I think most soccer historians kind of stop at, which kind of sort of percolated in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and for decades, frankly, kept the spirit, I guess, of the sport alive, largely through still ethnic lenses, which made a lot of sense because you had a lot of immigrants, and that was a sport that they brought over. But I was amazed to find out, as I dug deep into this book, a very interesting little storyline. And that's going to be our focus of our conversation this week. We're going to go back to, believe it or not, 1894. And before you roll your eyes and sort of say, oh, I'm out. No, you should stay in, because this, as Dr. Bunk has found and gone into great depth with in this book, is actually, from what I can tell right now as the armchair historian, the beginnings of the professional game in earnest in the United States. I think far earlier than most people, even soccer historians, would have even guessed. And here's the kicker, as the clip sort of hinted at, maybe, sort of. In the 1890s, baseball was undergoing some very interesting things, and it was baseball owners, believe it or not, those very same Boston Bean Eaters owners and Baltimore Orioles owners and Brooklyn Bridegrooms owners, etc., who were behind the founding of a league, a professional league, to play in their stadiums in 1894 called the American League of Professional Football. Yeah, this was soccer, financed and publicized and promoted by the owners of baseball teams. Now, by the way, that's interesting for a whole bunch of reasons. And it only lasted a year, and there was even a competitor league. We're going to get into all of that with Brian Bunk in a few minutes. But it's also the beginnings of what became and has been a theme over time. Now more pronounced as team owners can be, owners of different teams from different leagues. But for a long time ago, that wasn't sort of the case. But, if you go back to the 1960s with the rise of what ultimately became the North American Soccer League, remember, friends, there were 3, count them, fledgling attempts to launch leagues in 1966 and 67, 2 of which actually got off the ground. And of course, in American soccer style, kind of beat each other up and sort of enervated the whole process. But you can look into the records there. I mean, there were just about every baseball owner at the time had either a majority or a minority or at least a passing interest in this fledgling soccer thing. Is maybe another big thing, and certainly something to help fill up some dates when maybe our baseball teams weren't in town. But that I was shocked, frankly, to sort of see that idea began in earnest in 1894. And that's what we're going to get into, because by the way, it sows so many original seeds of many, many themes that we've talked about on this little podcast over the years, that seem like they're new or modern day issues, challenges, interestingnesses, but really aren't any really new. In the 1890s, this is very much a baseball story as much as it is a soccer story. And that's what makes this fascinating. And as the clip sort of hinted at, the 1890s was a very interesting transitional time for the National League. It had fought off a players' league in rebellion. It had absorbed that. There was this American Association sort of in the background that ultimately kind of went sideways and then kind of reinvigorated itself. And as the century turned, 1902-ish, I think it was. I'm sorry, I'm not a baseball historian by trade, but the American League came about. By that time, by the end of the decade, all this sort of experimentation and fumfering around of this sort of evolution, I guess, of the professional baseball ownership world and a dalliance with professional soccer was really kind of sort of floating all around. And, we'll get into the reasons why it was attempted, the reasons why the owners thought this would be interesting business-wise, culturally. We'll get into why it died a very quick death and how. But interestingly, also the beginnings of why the idea didn't necessarily die in 1894, but came back again and again and again on a number of different levels, including a persistence for pro soccer, which we now, in theory, enjoy with the 25th year and counting of Major League Soccer and things prior to such, as we've discussed in previous episodes. So that's our long-winded way into our conversation that we're going to get into in just a few moments with Dr. Brian Bunk. We're going to talk about the 1894 dual professional leagues led by the Baseball Owners American League of Professional Football. Fascinating stuff. And you will absolutely enjoy this conversation in a few moments' time. So please stay tuned. Let's get a little promotional goodness out of the way. This week, we're going to stick with soccer and our pal Kevin Schultz and his site, extratimevintage.com. extratimevintage.com. Code for you there is good seats for 10% off all of your purchases. What are you going to find there? You're going to find a lot of interesting soccer team logos from various leagues of the past. Now, not all the way back into the American League of Professional Football, but we certainly see the MISL and the National Professional Soccer League. The NASL has a few teams represented in there. There are things from the American Soccer League in there, as well as other little leagues here and there. The American Indoor Soccer Association. It's all fascinating. And frankly, this is a place where some of the more obscure teams and logos can be found. And what can you get them on? Well, how about a hoodie, a long sleeve t-shirt, mugs, youth size t-shirts, different colors, men's, women's styles, all of those. And it's just, there's probably a team and a league memory there just waiting for you that you probably didn't realize could be and was available in any of those forms. Some really great, don't call them obscure, but fascinatingly so, logos from soccer teams that you just may have missed or perhaps remember, but needed a little poke to actually remember. Again, it's extratimevintage.com. The promo code there is good seats, and 10% off all of your purchases is there for you. When you check there out, check it out. Yes, that's what he's trying to say, early and often. And we appreciate Kevin's sponsorship of the show this week, and we thank you kindly. All right, let's get into our conversation, shall we? Now, remember, the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs, i.e. the National League, was the progenitor of this American League of Professional Football that we're going to get into. We're going to dial it back to 1894. And listen for some names: the Washington Senators, the Philadelphia Phillies, the New York Giants, the Boston Beaneaters, the Baltimore Orioles, and the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, who ultimately became the Brooklyn Dodgers. All of these teams were part of this league. Fascinating stuff. Let's get into it. Here's our conversation we had with Brian just last week. Please enjoy. When I saw your book come out, I obviously wanted to see what of the professional game you kind of went into, and I want to get into your sort of the background of how you got sort of interested in the topic in the first place. But I guess the goal here, I would love to be able to. Well, it feels and sounds quote unquote moldy oldie, which I know is a little heretical to an historian, right? But it's to me it's very, very interesting because the way you lay it out and the way I understand sort of these, I guess, really initial true professional explorations of the sport of soccer in the United States. I mean, it really is, I want to say everything old is new again, but a lot of the themes and some of the issues of soccer and pro sports generally play out in, admittedly, even the 1894. Baseball teams getting involved in soccer, recognizing ethnic groups, and there's a real interest in the sport from folks who have just come to the country and that kind of stuff. So I don't know how altogether different, frankly, some of this stuff is from the 1920s of the American Soccer League and the 1960s of what became the NASL. It feels to me like this is almost the beginning of still an ongoing sort of generative story about pro sports and soccer in this country, perhaps to the amazement of many people so far back.
I think that's right. There are a lot of similarities and a lot of details that will continue to play out, and maybe one could argue continue to play out in the history of professional soccer in this country. There are going to be some significant differences, and I guess we'll talk about those, but you're absolutely right that there are certainly things that the collapse of these two leagues in 1894 were kind of the beginning of a whole series of problems and challenges that would plague professional soccer in this country, for decades afterwards.
Well, before we get into sort of the meat and potatoes of all of it, why don't we just sort of step back and give me a sense of your professional career and or personal interest that sort of led you to this part of and probably least known part of the American soccer landscape and soccer journey, because you're truly an historian by trade, correct?
Right. I mean, I was trained as a historian of modern Spain, actually. And, when I spent time in Europe doing research, that's where I sort of learned to really enjoy and became a fan of soccer as a sport. Because when I was growing up, it wasn't really, I was around during the NASL years, and although I wasn't really a huge fan, and it wasn't really played in the same way that it is today in the place where I was growing up in Wisconsin. And so, American football was kind of the king, and basketball was probably a close second. And I had spent some time living in Minneapolis, where, of course, hockey is really big. But soccer still wasn't really played by kids in the same way that it is today. So I didn't grow up playing the sport, and I kind of only had a vague awareness of the sport until I really started to get interested in European history. And so that's how I kind of came into soccer as a fan, or as someone who appreciates the game. And I studied Spanish history in graduate school, but not sport history. And I wrote a book about a revolution that happened in 1934, but that was more of a political and cultural history. And then I was kind of looking around for topics for my next research project, and I became interested in boxing. I became interested in the Spanish immigrant community to New York City, and being a historian, I thought, well, I'll go and find the book that someone has written about Spanish immigrants to New York City, and I found that at that time there was very little research into Spanish immigration to the United States. Now, admittedly, the numbers were small compared to other groups from Europe, like from Germany or Ireland or Italy, those sorts of places. So it maybe makes a little sense. And so I began to dig in and do research about that community. And I found out that they had their own soccer league in the 1920s, the Spanish American Soccer League. And I didn't know much about the history of soccer in the United States. And so I thought, well, I'll go find a book on American soccer history from this period, only to discover that there really weren't any books on the subject.
Of course not, because as we all know, the professional soccer game didn't start until Major League Soccer in 1996. So, of course, just kidding.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
People think that, right? These kids today.
Yeah. It was around that time that Roger Alloway's books came out or started to come out, and Colin Jones' book on the American Soccer League. So there were some kind of the beginnings of that research kind of trickling out, but there really wasn't a whole lot done. So that kind of made me become interested in the history of soccer. And then gradually, I think as I did more and more research, I gravitated, and to a certain extent, I still am maybe more interested in the early kinds of things, maybe before World War II, as opposed to the later stuff. And obviously, the book really only goes up to about 1920. So I really became interested in kind of the earliest stuff in the 19th century, and so that kind of culminated in the work that went into writing the book.
Which is interesting because it. So you're mentioning some of the previous works, right? So the American Soccer League, I think even, I would argue most pro soccer fans kind of at least know that was part of the background, at least just by a name or an appellation, right? The NASL certainly a little bit more in focus. Certainly you got some team names that have been reincarnated in today's Major League Soccer. But I think when you dial it all the way back, what did you think as you were sort of looking, I guess, maybe at this sort of pre-ASL kind of thing? What did you think you were going to find? I doubt, seriously, you thought you were going to find not one but two leagues, and in the late 1800s, and attached to baseball and the ownership of such to boot.
Yeah. I mean, there was some research. Steve Holroyd, who you've had on the show, I think a couple of times, had written maybe one of the first histories of this league, of the the American League of Professional Football, the 1894 league. So there was a little bit of that, but it really the other league was virtually unknown because there was some kind of confusion sometimes in the newspaper reports about exactly what league was being talked about, and it didn't help that there was a Philadelphia team in both leagues. And so there was a little bit of confusion about that, and that wasn't really resolved until I had asked Ed Farnsworth, who has also done a lot of interesting research on these professional leagues, if he had looked at a particular newspaper because it wasn't available in a digital format, and he went and looked at the newspaper, and that's where we really found out for the first time, or confirmed maybe for the first time, that there was this second professional league. So as a historian, it's always exciting when you can kind of find those things or help facilitate. I mean, Ed did the initial research. I mean, I didn't expect. I knew that there was one league. I didn't expect to find two, I guess. Yeah.
Well, all right. So let's get into it. Let's dial it back. 1894, and we've had a number of conversations about some of the earliest days of baseball in this country. Right, very formative. The beginnings of take us back. Right, the National League, as we know it today, was very much around. There was not yet the American League. That didn't come until the turn of the century. But there was this American Association, which, by many historians' counts, was essentially becoming a viable, at least of enough of a challenge and a different sort of presentation of this still formative professional version of baseball. But so tell us, I guess, around that time, as baseball itself was still kind of getting its professional sea legs, how does even the soccer come into the mix and as itself a professional league? Because it would seem like this baseball thing was plenty to keep people busy with what was becoming a pretty popular pastime, especially from the amateur years prior.
Yeah, I mean, the National League had been, as you said, kind of struggling and competing against these various other leagues, including the American Association. But I think it was by 1891, those leagues had dissolved, and the National League had sort of emerged as the only major professional baseball league. And I think, as I write about in the book, I think once they cleared the books, the debt that was caused by the competition for players and other debts when they bought the franchises and so forth from the American Association. By 1893, the end of 1893, going into the 1894 season, they were kind of in the best position they had been in maybe in decades, in terms of their financial health, in terms of their position as kind of the undisputed top American professional baseball league. And so I guess I would argue that maybe they thought this was an opportunity. This was the best time that they had maybe found in quite some time to maybe try to launch something else. And I mean, I think there was talk over the a few years before 1894 about creating another major professional team sport league. Because, I mean, boxing was huge and horse racing, and there were some other sports, but there really wasn't another significant professional team sport. Basketball was still in its infancy. College football was a huge thing, but that was amateur and connected to intercollegiate athletics. Issues that still are very pertinent today were a part of that discussion, even in the 1890s. So I think soccer seemed like it could be an opportunity for them to add another kind of professional team sport to their roster, as it were, and then that would allow them to use to fill stadiums, to maybe have the baseball players play year round. They would play soccer for 6 months and then play baseball for 6 months. So it would be a way of generating additional revenue, additional profit for these baseball owners. And at the same time, they would retain control over major professional team sports in the United States.
Okay, so this is interesting. So let me unpack that for a second. So a couple of sort of things there. Number one, you're kind of describing, I guess, a year-round kind of thing, and I'm assuming implied in that is the programming of content, shall we say, for their various stadiums and locations, right? So that beyond just a baseball season, there could be, I'm guessing, probably with not much too much overlap, a soccer season to kind of keep the building sort of operating closer to year round. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, they did obviously host college football games in the college football season, but that ran, from September to January or something like that. So they had, January till March or April or whenever the baseball season officially, began. They needed to fill those, or they wanted to, I think, to fill the stadiums. And I think also they felt like they could schedule soccer games during the week, maybe in the same way that they had baseball games at different days, not just on the weekends. And so this was an opportunity to not only fill that downtime in the early part of the year, but also to fill the downtime in the middle of a week or early part of a week or something when, a stadium might be booked for a college football game on a Saturday. It might be booked a couple of days on a weekend for some sort of, horse show or some other kind of spectacular, that kind of a thing. But those were not going to be weekly, everyday, reliable content, reliable revenue generators that they could have. I guess that's what we would say today, right? A revenue stream that they could count on during the week and then during the time when college football wasn't playing on weekends and baseball hadn't yet started.
Well, another thing that also strikes me, what you just said, was that this sort of attempt or some ideal of having, I don't know, I guess what the Europeans would sort of call a sporting club, sort of a brand that would encompass multiple sports, not just one professional sport. Like the ACs of the world, as they've sort of shortened in European terms. And do I have this right? And did I hear you correctly with perhaps part of that assumption being that the players might even play more than one sport, in this case, both baseball and soccer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge in one sense because we don't have a lot of institutional records. Most of the information that we've been able to glean about these leagues comes from newspaper reports, and those can be unreliable. They are often, they often assume knowledge that maybe people at the time had, but we don't have. So we have to kind of draw some conclusions and make some assumptions. And I don't know, we don't have any evidence really to suggest that the baseball owners were moving in the direction that you're suggesting. It's certainly possible. I looked through the catalog of the Baseball Hall of Fame to see if there might be any records from some of these clubs or from some of these individuals who owned the clubs about what their intentions were, correspondence, and I couldn't find anything. If any of your listeners have any ideas, that would be great. So we don't really have a good window into exactly what they were thinking about, except for we know based on their actions before the league and then after the league that they were interested in money and in revenue and in much like I suppose many franchise owners today, keeping costs low in terms of player salaries and keeping revenue high. And that, revenue can come from ticket sales. It can come from all sorts of other revenue streams. And I think that's what the baseball owners were doing. And having them play more than one sport was a way of keeping salaries down while increasing revenue without spending more money or investing more money in a whole nother roster of players.
Well, sure. It also, frankly, to me, smacks also of probably wanting to attract fans, perhaps who were either just becoming interested in this professional baseball thing, or my guess is maybe even a whole nother swath of fan who was not particularly interested in baseball or was not sort of flocking to it. And I'm guessing, and I'm projecting here, so you're the official historian, so you tell me, and I want to sort of just generally lump it as the quote unquote immigrant crowd, but folks from, recently arrived in the United States, right? Who, baseball was not even close to being the quote unquote national pastime we know it to be today. And I would imagine you had a whole sort of raft of folk, especially working class folk who, brought with them their memories and or desires to continue to at least find an outlet for things that they remember from their homelands. And I'm guessing that soccer was probably a little closer to that than for their leisure dollar, so to speak, than a baseball game would be.
Mm-hmm. I do think that they did want to kind of capture, I mean, again, I'm putting it in very modern terms, but I think they did want to try to capture consumer dollars that maybe they wouldn't, with baseball or during the baseball season or something like that. So I think they were trying to expand the audience for professional team sports, and that's part of the reason why they felt like they might be able to have weekend game or weekday games as opposed to just exclusively games on the weekends. It was a way of capturing those dollars that they might not otherwise be able to do. So I do think that was definitely part of it, was trying to expand an audience. I wonder, I mean, it's one thing that I think it's easy to dismiss these leagues, especially the American League of Professional Football, because it was such a debacle and it closed down so quickly. And for so long, professional soccer was, maybe not as big of a sport. I mean, we have the 1920s, but then again, it takes until the 1970s and so forth. So I think it's easy to kind of dismiss them, but in some ways they were ahead of their time. And I think it maybe in two ways. One is that, it was in the 1920s that the NFL starts. And so there was clearly, at least by that point, an audience for a team sport, during the winter months or during the fall or something like that. So they kind of anticipated the notion that a professional football league would be successful, even if they were kind of ahead of the game by a couple of decades. The other thing, though, I think you're right about that the 1920s and the American Soccer League in particular did definitely appeal to different ethnic groups, and American soccer in general kind of had that reputation after the demise of the ASL in the late 1920s, and so soccer became associated with all these different ethnic groups. But I mean, I don't know how much of that they would have, whether that would have been enough of a motivation, because I mean, soccer still was not the sport that we think of today in much of Europe or in South America in 1894 as it is today. And so, I mean, soccer had been played in places like Spain, much earlier, but it wasn't yet quite the level, the dominant sport in the sense that it is today. So it could be that they were trying to expand the audience. I'm just not sure necessarily that they were conceiving of that audience as being particular ethnic groups that maybe weren't necessarily attracted to baseball. So I think you're right. They were ahead of the game in various ways. I'm just not sure how conscious that decision was.
No, that makes sense. And it also augurs more for your sort of, my term, umbrella sort of sporting kind of approach, where baseball was sort of the lead story, but perhaps could be, branched out into other sports. I mean, look, the chapter that we're talking about, your chapter 5 from your book, is the book is titled "From Football to Soccer," right? And I'm guessing, and maybe you can kind of illuminate for the audience a bit, that this is also a bit of a form evolution of what quote unquote soccer is, right? Because or football, right? Clearly on the college level, it was starting or had started, right? The early college game. But we all know from our history books of college football, right, that even that sort of traditional American gridiron version of the game certainly was not nearly what it looks like today, right? It had elements of what we know today as soccer. It had elements of what we know today as rugby and or now American football, right? So I guess the question in there is 1894, having you putting us sort of to task here to sort of really kind of put it in a better framework. what is this sport at this time? It certainly sounds like it wasn't quote unquote soccer as we kind of know it today. It feels maybe more it was part of the formation of something other than baseball, for that matter.
I mean, right. The book, I guess, is called From Football to Soccer because there was a whole bunch of different games that were played all over the country by boys and young men, at least initially, then taken up by schools and colleges, and even women sometimes played these games. And they didn't necessarily have a set of hard and fast rules, and they might vary from place to place to place. And that's what happens with the colleges and the universities where, Yale develops its kind of own form of football, and Harvard does the same, and Princeton has its version. And right, they do contain different elements of what we would today know as soccer and rugby and American football, but the emphasis on carrying the ball or kicking the ball or how often or what are the conditions under which you can catch the ball or can you run with the ball, all of that was kind of up for debate or up for could change over time. And so it's only really in 1863 when the association rules are codified and written down, and then rugby a little bit later. And then that's when you begin to see the American colleges are also starting to finally write down their own rules. And as you said, they're related to modern games. They're related to the association rules developed in England. They're related to the rugby rules, but they're not similar to what we would know today. I think by the time we get at 1894, it's more recognizable as soccer for sure. The rules had been codified. You have professional association football in England and in Scotland. And so I think it probably looked more like professional soccer looks today than college football would look like college football does today, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. But it's definitely clear that the form of it, right, is look, we also have to remember too that baseball was still in its it certainly was professional, but it's still formative, right? I mean, a lot of the rules were kind of baked in, but it still evolved as a game as well in itself, right? The pro game in the United States of baseball, right, had only been maybe a decade or two old, right, having been largely an amateur thing, and there was a whole debate about whether professionalism was good for the sport in the first place. So that's also part of the dynamic here, right? Here's yet another attempt at a professional league when the very idea of professionalism was still not sort of fully settled as being a noble enterprise, as baseball had maybe turned the corner on, but it certainly wasn't an easy path for sure.
Exactly. I mean, baseball for a long time, or professional baseball, was kind of plagued with this reputation as being sort of a slightly disreputable, occupation for sure, and that players were infamous for being drunk, on the field and off the field, for being violent, for it being kind of a rough sport and not necessarily one that had a lot of status attached to it. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of the soccer communities in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s, when they really start to begin to grow, they really did kind of cling to this notion of amateurism. And part of that is a holdover from the attitudes in England and Scotland against professionalism, and that soccer was this kind of noble athletic pursuit for gentlemen, and so that was kind of ingrained into many, if not most, of the soccer communities in the United States. And so I think that may be another reason why the baseball owners, they were less attached to that, or maybe not attached at all to that. I mean, they ran professional sports franchises, so clearly they didn't have a problem with that. They didn't feel like they could take that away from college football, which also had that kind of, I think I quote in the book one of the baseball managers talking about there's a patina of amateurism around college football, and they weren't willing to get rid of that or to challenge that. But soccer, I mean, it was professionalized in England and in Scotland by this point, and I think they were a lot less reluctant to do that. Whereas the soccer community itself, the American Football Association and other local communities, they didn't want to take that next step, which is maybe why they didn't make moves towards creating a professional league of their own, except for, of course, the association that I guess we'll talk about a little bit. So I think that kind of goes into why it was baseball owners who did it, and not necessarily people from within the soccer community.
So give us a sense then of how this becomes even an agenda item, he says, not so easily, for these National League owners at all, right? The idea of launching something different off the backs of their current operations. Why a soccer versus, say, something else? Maybe this was the beginning of something bigger, as you maybe hinted at earlier, but multi-sport. But, I mean, how does 1893-ish come about as a conversation piece around, hey, let's set up a soccer league as well, in addition to our still fledgling professional baseball endeavors?
Well, I think it had to do with the fact that they were probably hearing or, getting word that there were discussions about forming some sort of professional football league, and that there had been instances, within a couple of years. I think 1892 is the first documented professional football player playing in what was then, intercollegiate football. So it was kind of in the background there, bubbling up. And I think the baseball owners felt like they did not want, if there was going to be another professional team sport, they wanted in on it, and they wanted to be able to control it, because, as we talked about earlier, they had these stadiums already, and they maybe didn't want people to form a professional team sports league that would maybe somehow be able to compete ultimately with the National League in terms of baseball. And I think they did cast around, and they talked about, can we use the intercollegiate rules of football? And that didn't seem to work. Can we use rugby rules? And that didn't seem to work. And so I think they hit on association football because there was this immigrant community. There were these communities in New York and Brooklyn and Philadelphia and places like Fall River and Pawtucket who were playing soccer. And they could easily, point to the success of the Football League in England and say, look at these people are attracting tens of thousands of people to these big matches. If we can get even a tenth of that kind of a crowd, I mean, we'll be making money hand over fist. So I think it was a combination of all of those things. The fact that they were in a financially a comfortable position, the fact that there was talk about forming some sort of professional team sport league for the winter months. Maybe there weren't other great options, right? Intercollegiate football, no. Basketball, no. I mean, hockey, no, right? I mean, the big American sports today, none of those, except for football, was really a viable option. So I think, like I said, the impact of the crowds in England, I mean, people would report, newspapers would regularly report on big matches in England and talk about the crowds there and the success of the professional leagues there. And so I think that also had an impact on their decision and why they might have chosen soccer.
That's fascinating to me, and equally fascinating. And I think this is really maybe what sort of brings this to, I guess, the more mainstream sports fan, perhaps. The American League of Professional Football, and I want to get to its competitor too, which was new groundbreaking stuff that you discovered. Besides, there was another league sort of floating around this time as well. Again, sounding like a chase for money for sure. But circa 1890, I mean, talking about 1894, I am I'm gobsmacked by the fact that 6 of the then, I think, 12 National League teams at the time stood up, were sponsored, or some combination thereof, teams in this professional soccer league known as the American League of Professional Football, including 5 teams whose lineages still exist today, right? The LA Dodgers via the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, the Baltimore Orioles partially by name. I guess that's not really a consecutive thing because there were a number of Orioles teams, but the Boston Bean Eaters, which are known today by direct lineage as the Atlanta Braves, the New York Giants, which exists in San Francisco today by a very long-winded way, and then the Philadelphia Phillies. I think many hardened and wizened and historically emboldened baseball fans would have a hard time believing that those teams were behind essentially the first professional endeavor in soccer in this country. I didn't know that, and I'm a huge soccer fan and have been for some time. I didn't know that until recently, until your book came out, and it scratched sort of the surface of. It's hard to believe, right? Ironic on a lot of different levels, prescient in some respects, I guess, if you really take a long view of it. I'm just wondering how it sort of got effected, like how they made this sort of a viable opportunity. Did they co-promote with their baseball games? How do they get the sort of word out? How do they approach the fields and try to set up the stadiums appropriately and that kind of stuff? The logistics of it seem even more intriguing.
It does. I mean, I think one of the things that they did is, even though oftentimes the baseball managers or the managers of the baseball teams were listed as the official managers of the soccer teams, I think what really happened was that they would find someone who had roots in a particular and contacts and connections in a particular soccer community, and then they would bring that person on board, oftentimes as a player, but also as a coach and as probably as a recruiter as well, to get people to sign. And so you do see the case, like for instance in Baltimore, where A.W. Stewart is brought on board, and he had long roots in the Detroit community there, and he brought along all sorts of players from Detroit, and then Baltimore, of course, imported some of these English players. But I think he effectively functioned as both a coach, a player, a team captain, and maybe even in a sense, maybe it's a stretch to say something of a general manager like we would think of today. So I think that was. They definitely relied on those sorts of things. The Brooklyn team, for instance, had Dennis Shea, who was an experienced goalkeeper, had gone to Great Britain in 1891 with the U.S. Canadian team and did this long tour. So he had important connections in Fall River and in other areas, and they essentially brought along a lot of players who had already played together on different teams in Fall River or Pawtucket or Detroit. Or some Philadelphia or Trenton, so they did, I think, rely on soccer people to fill the rosters, to do with the whatever training and that sort of thing that they had. And then, I mean, they did have, they already had the facilities in the baseball stadiums. It's unclear to me, how much promotion they did. They might put ads in the newspapers occasionally, but I don't know beyond that. Again, it's really a lack of sources. It lasted for so short of a time that we don't have, I mean, as far as I know, I've never seen a poster or any kind of advertisement. I've never seen a photograph from any of these games or any of these teams, except for those that were printed in the newspapers, not as photographs, but as prints probably based on photographs. So we don't, as far as the promotion, we could make guesses that they were probably working in similar ways to the way that soccer communities had been doing it up to that point. But again, our lack of source material means that we kind of have to make a leap and to sort of, I wouldn't say guess, make informed guesses about how that all functioned.
So where did you find then the source material, I guess, to kind of sort of hang your hat on, I guess, the existence of this? I'm guessing that these teams, these baseball teams, right, was probably sort of somewhere in some murky little corners of their histories that it sort of became evident.
I guess I haven't. I I haven't read too much into the individual team histories, I have to admit. I did look at histories of baseball during this period, but they don't necessarily mention it because I think it was sort of a blip on the radar. And there was more concern and more attention given to the possibility of a new baseball league, which emerged right around the same time that the soccer league was also launching. And so I think that has tended to draw the attention of both the baseball owners at the time and then subsequent histories. A lot of this really plays out in the newspapers. I mean, they put out a press statement announcing the formation of the league in February 1894, and then the press publishes stories about the games and match reports, we would call them today. There are other reports, particularly in Fall River. Fall River was probably the most soccer mad city in the United States in the 1890s. And so the newspapers there spent a great deal of time covering this, in part because so many of the players would have been familiar to Fall River newspaper readers. And I think there were some people in Fall River who were a little peeved that they were not given an opportunity to have a team. So like I said, a lot of this information comes from the newspapers, and that's why it was so hard to really find out about the existence of the American Association of Professional Football, because sometimes the reports are incomplete, or sometimes they confuse one of the teams with the other, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it really can be a challenge in piecing together a lot of the nitty-gritty details about how these leagues functioned. And as I said, I searched for correspondence or other kinds of materials, and I by the time I had to complete the book, I hadn't found anything.
Okay, well, now you're bringing up sort of the other sort of competitive league in all of this. So why don't we back into that part of the story too? We've been sort of circling to start with around this American League of Professional Football, which was an effort by these National League baseball owners to get a league off the ground. But you're bringing to bear something completely as a rival league, this American Association of Professional Football. So number one, what is and was that? Where did sort of that come from? And am I correct in assuming that this fledgling, governing body of the sport as it was finding its way into the world, this American Football Association from about a decade earlier, had maybe something to do with it?
Mm-hmm. The American Association of Professional Football was also launched in the fall of 1894, and it does seem as though it was created as a deliberate attempt to, I don't know if sabotage might be too long or too strong of a word, but certainly compete with and contend with the American League of Professional Football. And it seems it was the brainchild of a guy named Clement Beecroft, who had been involved in the soccer scene in Philadelphia and had played a key role in launching the first soccer league in that city. He had some close connections with the folks at the American Football Association, which, as you said, kind of styled itself as the national governing body, but it was really limited to the East Coast, the area of Philadelphia, northern New Jersey, and up into New England. And they had started the American Cup competition in 1885, and that was seen, I think, as a kind of de facto national championship. And so they were very protective of that competition. And I think in many ways, the AFA felt like this new professional league was going to challenge the primacy of the American Cup as kind of being the championships of the United States, so to speak. It's unclear if there was any kind of official relationship between the AFA and the American Association of Professional Football. I know Beecroft would have known people within the association. Some of the officers associated with the clubs in that league also would later go on to hold important leadership positions in the AFA. So clearly there was some personnel overlap there. But Again, we don't really have the kind of documentation that would allow us to make any kind of really strong connections between the two organizations. The records, or the institutional records, the archive of the American Football Association is lost, or maybe it exists somewhere. Hopefully, it exists somewhere in someone's basement. So we don't have the kinds of institutional records that we would like to have, and so we have to kind of piece things together from newspaper reports, from kind of how it was reported at the time, and then kind of events subsequent to that. So, but it does seem clear that it was designed to compete with the American League of Professional Football.
Yeah, and you say in the book that the association, the American Association of Professional Football, had just 4 clubs, but they were clearly went for the jugular geographically, right? Philadelphia, which also had a team in this American League in the form of the Phillies, Trenton, Patterson, and Newark, right? And you even make some allusions to the fact that maybe the Newark team was really actually an amateur team that had some success in Kearney, which we all know is, probably one of the longest rooted historical sort of tributaries, I guess, to the sports history in this country, right? It's interesting though, because you wonder how that motivation comes about, right? And how a league, a challenger league, if you will, would sort of be able to even stand up against, I don't know, where was Beecroft sort of coming from, given the fact that he was essentially trying to ringlead a challenge to what was really the only professional sports league in this country, in the form of the National League. I mean, did he think he even had a chance, right? Or was some other stuff going on behind the scenes? Maybe he was getting supported somehow, or was this just we'll just try to do it better and maybe do it in closer backyards, maybe than this National League is trying to do?
They definitely felt like they could do it better. They felt like they were coming from a soccer community and that they knew the sport and they knew how to organize the sport. And they criticized the American League of Professional Football for thinking that they could have games on weeknights, for instance, that even in the Football League in England, they played on weekends. They didn't have weekday games in England. So they chided the American League of Professional Football for not knowing that kind of stuff. They also felt like too many games in a week would be too hard on the players. And again, they chalked that up to sort of the ignorance that the baseball owners had about how the sport of soccer actually functioned on the ground. So I do think that they had maybe a sense that they were more familiar with the sport. I also think that they had, on some level, the support, whatever that might have meant, of the AFA. They did plan on having a team in New York and Brooklyn, which would have also directly competed with the American League of Professional Football. So it's one of those unanswered questions about exactly what were their motivations. Were they just trying to sort of be a thorn in the side? The way that the American Association sort of collapsed, or just almost like dissipated once the American League of Professional Football canceled its season, really does kind of reinforce, to my mind, the idea that it was designed simply to be kind of a competitor and a thorn, and not necessarily conceived of as a viable long-term project. But as I say, I don't have any direct evidence for that. But given all of the what we do know, that I think is a reasonable assumption. There also was an overall lack of competitive balance in the American Association, and the team from Philadelphia was just simply so much better than the other clubs that it makes you wonder how viable that would have been long term anyway.
So you're describing two leagues that were essentially playing in the fall. Do I have that right in terms of the calendar?
Their plans were essentially their plans were to play from September to December, And then the American Association had talked about also having a spring league. And I'm not sure. I think eventually the American League of Professional Football was also going to have a spring schedule, because as I was just talking about earlier, that they wanted, once the turn of the new year happened, the college football season was over. And then they could hold, then you would have more open dates to presumably fit in soccer league matches. So they were planning a fall season and then likely a spring season as well.
How would you describe each league's based on what you're able to uncover? And you do have some fascinating little tidbits. They're hardly tidbits; these are all sort of factually strung storylines here. Would you call either league a quote unquote success, or relatively which one did better in quotes?
I think the American League of Professional Football was probably a better league in that the facilities were professional facilities,
even though they were baseball essentially.
Right.
Focused.
Yeah, but they were the Polo Grounds had capacity of tens of thousands of people. They were major league stadiums for 1894. Certainly not like they are today, but they were as good as it got in terms of professional or sporting stadiums, I guess. I think the competitive balance was better in the American League, and the quality of the players, a lot of probably, if we could classify the best players in the United States at that time, they were more likely to be playing in the American League than they were in the American Association. It's really difficult to judge player quality. Some of the English players that were brought over to play for Baltimore, after the league fell apart, they went back to England, and they never really, even though they played for clubs, the club that would eventually become Manchester City, for instance, they were never star players. They never were like what we would call first team regulars today. And yet they were seen as among the best players in the league when they came over to the United States. And then once they went back to England, they really never had much of a career in professional football after that, whether that was because they were sort of blacklisted because of their willingness to jump to the American League, or whether it was just simply they were not good enough to hold down a regular first team position on an professional English club. One of those players likened the quality or the level of play in the American League of professional football as being on the equivalent of a kind of regional league in England. So not even like, not approaching the quality of the football league or, top level professional football in England. Now, that could be sour grapes. It could be an early example of, non-American soccer people sort of looking down their nose at American soccer, which is a common theme. So we don't really know. He was giving that comment to an English newspaper, so he could have been playing up a little bit to the audience there. But so I would say the American League of Professional Football was probably more professionally run, had a higher quality of player, and a more competitive league overall.
But I'm guessing that was to the chagrin of this American Football Association. Again, sort of this, early-ish kind of version of what is now, U.S. Soccer, United States Soccer Federation, or the beginnings of sort of the overlords, if you will, of the sport. And I sort of asked it before, but maybe I'll ask it more directly here. I mean, did the American Football Association, the AFA, this governing body, so to speak, try to kind of muddy up the works, either against the American League or perhaps in behind and supporting the American Association? Because it seems to me, if I read some of your notes correctly, the AFA was trying to kind of cast a pall on the players in the American League, almost to the point of either banning or preventing them, hauntingly similar to the bizarre world of 1967 years later, right, with the NPSL versus the United Soccer Association, and one being, quote unquote, officially sanctioned by U.S. Soccer / FIFA at the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one being sort of a group of outlaws. It sounds like the AFA was kind of trying to make the American League of Professional Football, backed by these National League owners, kind of an outlaw, like unofficial or unsanctioned version of soccer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that the baseball owners both loathed and feared was a rival league that would compete for players, pushing up costs, and also would challenge their monopoly over baseball in a particular city. And I think from the perspective of the AFA, and again, because we don't have the records, we can't 100% say for sure what was going on in the minds of the AFA officials. But I would argue that they felt like the baseball owners were doing exactly that to them, that they were coming into Philadelphia, they were coming into New York and Brooklyn and taking players from Fall River and Pawtucket and these areas, and challenging their monopoly over this competition that they viewed as the most important soccer competition in the United States. And so I think they were angry that the baseball owners were doing to them exactly what the baseball owners hated when it was done to them. And so I think that they felt like the American Cup competition would suffer if these players were competing in a professional league and not competing in the American Cup. Because, as I said, a lot of these players, especially from Fall River, came from clubs that had won the American Cup. Fall River clubs had entered into a period of dominance in the late 1880s, 1890s, when they were winning it every year, with Pawtucket also thrown in there at a couple of occasions. But so I think that, yeah, they felt as though the baseball owners were encroaching on their territory and that it would diminish their competition.
How were they received from fans and from the press? I mean, it's clear that not a lot of fans turned out for these games, although it looks like there were a couple of blips of sizable crowds, but certainly nothing approaching, sort of the average baseball attendance.
Right. I mean, there didn't seem to be any kind of confirmed crowds of, maybe only a handful where they got 1,000 people or more. And in some cases, there were really laughable numbers. I mean, of only a few dozen or a few hundred people at some of these games. So if we look at it from the sense of people paying or showing their support with their hard-earned dollars, or a quarter, which was the admission price at the time, there clearly wasn't a lot of public support for these leagues. The newspapers, the coverage was inconsistent, I would say. And when compared to, say, if you go through and you look through the sports pages at this time, there might be a small paragraph reporting on the scores. In some newspapers, in some markets, Philadelphia or Fall River, I mentioned before, there might be longer stories that include full match reports and lineups and really intelligent discussions of tactics, for instance. But that was definitely not the norm. I think in even some of the bigger markets like New York City, you don't generally get a lot of coverage of these teams, and certainly not on the level of baseball or boxing or some of these other, or college football for that matter, which was going on at the same time. And I think that was a contributing factor. I don't think it was a major factor, but I think that was a contributing factor in why these leagues failed to take off, was that the press was kind of either disinterested or suspicious about this whole operation and didn't necessarily spend a great deal of time reporting on it or promoting it or anything of that sort. It does seem that in soccer communities, like, for instance, Pittsburgh, which I also talk about in the book, the press was really behind these leagues for whatever reason. San Francisco was another place where, for a certain amount of time, the Call newspaper was really backing these leagues, publishing stories about players, getting involved in promoting the league, And so when that happened, soccer could develop an audience and attract crowds. But that didn't really happen for the American League of Professional Football, and didn't really happen for the American Association of Professional Football. And I don't really know why that is the case. Maybe the baseball owners didn't have the pull. Maybe the press relationship with the baseball owners was more contentious and suspicious than in some of these other soccer communities. But for whatever reason, the press was, I would maybe say, lukewarm about this whole operation.
All right, so why do you think that these two then leagues with a fledgling oversight governing body behind the scenes, why do you think it all just sort of abruptly just ended at the end of the one and only season of these two things? I mean, you're kind of describing perhaps, I mean, you would think that with two pro circuits and a fledgling governing body sort of out there, that there would be a year two, some kind of combination thereof. Maybe you put the teams together into a bigger or stronger league. You would have learned some lessons. But no, it literally just disappeared, and not only disappeared, but just went away. The whole idea of a professional league on this kind of scale went away for decades. I mean, what spooked them so, and why, do you think?
I think it was a combination of factors. I think they were surprised by just how little interest there was based on attendance. I mean, they repeatedly said in the newspapers that they were prepared to lose money, that the first season was going to be a challenge, and the aim was really to try to build interest and to build an audience. So they weren't naive enough to think that they were going to be selling out the Polo Grounds or whatever, in the first season. So they were savvy enough to know that it was going to take some work. But I think they maybe were a little bit shocked at how much work it was going to take and how few tickets they were actually selling, especially compared to the crowds that were coming up in England and Scotland. I also think that, and this is another way in which it kind of prefigures American soccer throughout the 20th century, is that having these rival leagues and having the American Football Association be against, I mean, they ban professional players from competing in AFA sanctioned matches. I think that, that infighting within the soccer community is a feature that will happen again and again and again. And so that doesn't contribute, that they weren't willing to kind of pull together and merge the teams or figure out some compromise with the American Football Association. I mean, that was one of the reasons why the American Soccer League ultimately fails, is because they couldn't reach an agreement about the professional leagues playing in the cup competitions and how the gate receipts were going to be divided. And so that kind of infighting and just squabbling within the soccer community, I think, contributed to the failure of these leagues. And then the announcement that there might be another baseball league, I think, was sort of like the final straw, that you had all of these other factors, the infighting, the lack of crowds, the expenses, the prospect of a long, difficult challenge to make this league viable, the possibility that you might have to compete with teams or compete internationally for players, as Baltimore had already brought over professionals from England. Were they going to have to pay to bring people over from England and Scotland in future seasons? So I think it was a combination of all those things. But the announcement that there was another potential rival baseball league waiting to start, that was kind of like, that's it. I think they just, at least most of the owners, there were reports that some owners wanted to carry on, but that was they needed to sort of gird themselves for another fight over baseball, and they just weren't willing to keep this soccer league going.
And was that rumored new professional or at least direct competitor to the National League in baseball, was that what ultimately became the American League in 1901?
I don't think so. I mean, the league in 1894 never came to fruition. I mean, maybe there were some people involved in what would eventually become the American League, but the league, as it was talked about in September and October of 1894, never ultimately materialized. So, in a sense, maybe if they had waited it out, that would have become clear. But I think that they were so angry and so upset at the idea that, just 3 years after they had finished off the last rival leagues, that there would be another rival league. I think that was just enough to tip the balance against the soccer leagues.
To me, that's fascinating. And obviously hindsight's always, proverbially 20/20, right? But you'd think that with that much sort of heat, I guess, around it for at least a hot year, and then the dissipation, if you will, of an actual league. Although it did 7 years later, the AL did sort of come into fruition. I'm sure there were some rumblings and some formative talks and stuff that probably scared off people. But I just find it very, very intriguing that there really wasn't anything of true substance. I mean, short of other people finding some other discoveries that you and I both don't know, beyond regional and sort of industrial leagues, anything approaching anything of a national, quote unquote, soccer professional league in this country until the 1920s. Why do you think it then took so long, and why did it just sort of disappear out of whole cloth for such a period of time? You'd think that there would have been at least another attempt or two. Maybe there were, we just don't know about them, or they just didn't sort of stick as much. But it seems to me like there's a gap, a big gap, until really the 20s when the ASL kind of started to coalesce.
I think a big factor is that the soccer communities tended to be highly local, really, and sometimes that might be a particular city, and sometimes it might be a particular region. And there were, we might call them semi-professional leagues that would crop up before that. For instance, in Fall River and in that area, there does seem to be some evidence that players were paid. Now, they probably weren't quitting their day jobs, and maybe they were paid a little bit or costs or something like that. So in that sense, semi-professional leagues would continue to exist. But you're right. There was talk occasionally about a regional league. There was one around the turn of the 20th century that was supposed to feature teams from St. Louis and Chicago and maybe Milwaukee and some of that area. But you're right. In terms of a national league, it really doesn't begin to take hold until the ASL in 1921. And I think part of that is that there is no, there isn't an organizing body. As you say, the AFA was still pretty regionalized, and what's now U.S. Soccer doesn't emerge until later. And so I think it was still maybe just all of these scattered small communities, and not anything kind of directly linking them all together until the federation comes along, and until Thomas Cahill has this idea that now we need to capitalize on the popularity of the sport, especially following World War I, and strike while the iron is hot, so to speak, and create a professional league. And by the time you get into 1920, 21, you do have soccer taking off all around the world. And so those immigrants who are coming from Spain or Italy or Germany or Austria or Hungary, they now have the kind of a sense of soccer in the way that you were talking about earlier. And so there is that audience or potential audience for professional soccer among these ethnic communities that maybe or almost certainly didn't exist in 1894. So I think it was a question of maybe having a slow buildup through the 19-teens, and then during and after World War I, there was a real burst of interest and enthusiasm for the sport, and so then that's what led to the formation of the ASL in 1921.
Well, that's another topic for another time, for sure. But let me ask you sort of this maybe sort of roundup question then. As an historian, somebody who's learned sort of the earliest, if you will, sort of attempts at a, if you will, a national pro circuit or two, such a long time ago. Do you see now that we've seen the sort of the other forms of the history of the sport sort of play out over the decades and centuries? Did you find any irony, like I have, say, in reading accounts of, say, the late 60s after the sort of in the wake of the 1966, first ever live U.S. televised World Cup final, and all the enthusiasm of, I guess it was at the time, 3 professional groups trying to sort of create a league or leagues of pro sports, and a lot of them were baseball owners. I just find that highly ironic and arguably almost ignorant. We're absolutely ignorant of maybe some of the learnings or watch-outs that maybe we've just spent the last hour or so describing, because I got the sense that, people like the guy who owned the Chicago White Sox at the time, Alwyn, and some of these others, right, were kind of just seeing easy money to be made off the backs of their professional sort of infrastructures with baseball. There's a question in there somewhere. To me, it seems a little ironic, and the proverbial those who ignore history are, doomed to something.
Right. No, I think you're right that there is. It's definitely, you can see the same mistakes or the same challenges playing out over the next century, really, in terms of professional soccer in the United States. I think it may be, now that we know more about this history, I think, we can see the irony in a way that I'm not sure that they could have known as much about the history as we do, because of, the fact that there are no, unlike, let's say, in England, for instance, or in other parts of the world where you have these clubs that have been around since the 1890s, and they have archives, some of them in better shape than others. The Football League has been around since 1888. So there is this institutional history that exists, and none of those clubs have survived, and none of the ASL clubs survived. And as I've said, we don't have the institutional records. And so it was only really when we had widespread digitization of newspapers that we've been able to piece together the information that we have. So I think you're right. Knowing what we know now, it is ironic, and it is interesting in how much, despite the fact that it only lasted a few weeks, that the American League of Professional Football in particular really faced a lot of the same challenges and made a lot of the same mistakes that would then be repeated over and over and over again. And so I think you're right. I can see the irony in that, but I just don't think they could have known, because almost no one knew about these leagues. Even people who knew a great deal about the history of American soccer, it was kind of this thing that was out there that people knew about, but the details were fuzzy.
Yeah, I personally, I would love to be able to somehow convince, coax, whatever, the remaining Major League Baseball teams that these original American League of Professional Football teams, were sort of rooted to, because you wonder, deep in the dark bowels of the upper, attics of these historical records and stuff, there's got to be some even further information about sort of the either the correspondence or some of it. I'm sure you've done yeoman's like work trying to find it, but I wonder in the in the dark crevices of, say, the Los Angeles Dodgers' offices, or San Francisco Giants, or the Atlanta Braves, right? These are all teams that, essentially trace direct lineage all the way back to this period in time in 1894. You just wonder if there's another piece or two of information that could maybe further solidify or give some sense as to, beyond what you've been able to sort of uncover here about that league and what else was going on in 1894. And it's from a different source, right? It's not from sort of the soccer history realm, which is obviously relatively smaller by comparison. I mean, there's no more hyper investigated and historically researched sport in this country than baseball, for God's sakes, right?
Yeah.
I just wonder if it's been glossed over or ignored or just forgotten or not seen because it wasn't about quote unquote baseball at the time.
I think that, I mean, that's one of the challenges of doing sport history is that it was often seen either by people within the sporting community as not necessarily worth preserving those records, and it was seen by people in the archive and scholarly community as not important records to keep. And so I think there were very few people maybe who had the motivation or the interest necessarily in preserving a lot of those records. As I said, from what I know about English soccer clubs, some of whom date back, more than 100 years, their archives are often in rough shape as well. I mean, that's changed over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, where now some of the bigger clubs especially have archivists on staff and have museums. But if the English clubs that have been around and have existed don't necessarily keep the best archives or keep the best records, it's not surprising maybe that this league that lasted only a few weeks has not preserved a lot of records. So, I mean, I would love it if there was something to be found in the baseball records, or it would be great. And maybe, I wouldn't feel bad at all if it challenged my conclusions and made me look wrong. But it would just be really wonderful to have that other voice, as you said, or those other voices on this topic.
Well, there it is, folks. A professional historian literally throwing out a challenge to people who want to step up. I mean, look, to me, it feels like there's just as much Cooperstown in a lot of aspects of the story as there is in, where is it now? Frisco, Texas, where the National Soccer Hall of Fame is, right? So, and I have a feeling this won't be the last word, but let's give you some chance to promote. This is but one chapter from a really fascinating book that goes into lots of the early history. This is just sort of the one and done year of professionalism in this period of time. Tell us about the book, where it can be found, how you're promoting it, and is this the last or just the beginning of a topic like this for you?
Well, the book, as we said, is From Football to Soccer, and it's published by the University of Illinois Press. It's available at all fine bookstores or online outlets, at least, or directly from the press. It really is kind of an examination from the earliest kinds of soccer-like sports played by Native Americans. I start with the chapter on Native American football or kicking games, and then kind of talk about the way the sport developed until we get to the codification of association football or soccer in 1863. And I wanted to look at maybe some things that hadn't been really examined in detail, like the Native American games, like some of these schoolboy games that we talked about at the colleges. I have a couple of chapters on women playing soccer, a subject that hasn't really been dealt with, at least in that early period, too much. I mean, there are some important works on early U.S. women's soccer, but I kind of wanted to add and amplify that. And then I tried to take a couple of different case studies and look at how those illustrate certain themes that were played out in different communities around the country. So there's a chapter on Pittsburgh soccer, where it kind of illustrating the sort of ups and downs of the leagues and competitions there, and some of the challenges that they faced in terms of infighting and squabbling and finding places to play, and how it kind of grew to be, in the early part of the 20th century in this major sport in Pittsburgh. I look at Western Massachusetts as well to sort of talk about the importance of industrial teams and industrial firms sponsoring soccer clubs in cities and communities around the country. I look at the effect of World War I, that really the more American men were exposed to soccer in terms of playing and watching the sport during World War I than maybe any other time in the country's history. The U.S. soccer and the YMCA spent in today's dollars millions of dollars to send soccer balls to Europe for soldiers. So that had a big impact on growing the game. And like I said, I kind of stop in 1920 with the beginning of the ASL because, as you said, that's kind of another topic for another day.
Yeah, well, which definitely I think still has many other sort of storylines to be further unearthed. You mentioned a few authors that have certainly delved into that, but this is a tremendous table set for that because the ASL just didn't pop out of nowhere either, and this is arguably an excellent way to sort of get a sense of as to how and why an American soccer league kind of evolved in the 1920s, and from there on, arguably, greater things supposedly for soccer in this country. I don't know. I've been such a fan of the sport since I sort of got inoculated to it in, I don't know, the mid to late 1970s. But just you go back in time. To me, it's just fascinating to know that. And ironic to hear, right? People still call the sport on the professional level still somewhat fledgling, right? That there are the naysayers of MLS and the Euro snobs, and it's not really blah blah blah. But it's like it'll be the sport of the future. It always has been for how many decades and centuries, right? But the history is very long and very deep, and the kudos to you for sort of amplifying that and solidifying it, and God forbid more can get added to the infrastructure that you've created here, because it clearly existed a long time ago and earlier than most people, I think, would have earlier known or admitted.
I think one of the things I hope that the book does is it does, show that the United States has this really long and rich history, and that in some ways, these professional leagues we've been talking about were the oldest professional leagues, or the first professional leagues outside of the British Isles. So, before, Brazil, before Spain, before Italy, those sorts of places had professional soccer leagues. The United States had two. Granted, as we talked about, they were not exactly successful, but just to get that out there that, as you said, soccer didn't begin in 1994, and it didn't begin with Pele, and it has these deep roots, even if they've been obscured or forgotten about, and it would be great to just make that understanding of that history maybe a bit broader, and knowledge of that history a bit broader, and maybe get people interested in learning more about that history, and especially history in different communities. I think, as I said before, these communities are oftentimes small, but almost in most major cities, you probably could find beginning in the late 19th century and into the 20th century some soccer communities, even in places that we might not think of, like Georgia. A colleague of mine, Patrick Sullivan, has done research on early soccer history in Georgia. Places like Colorado or Minnesota or San Francisco, Hawaii, for instance. So there's a lot of this history out there that I think would be of great interest to people. And I hope this is a first step in kind of that process, I guess, bringing that out.
Brian Bunk is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, which just so happens to house a wonderful assortment and assemblage of research for any sports history enthusiast or professional. It's called the McCormick Collection, and it's even made more interesting by the inclusion of an episode of this here little podcast. Yes, courtesy of our pal Upton Bell and our great conversation that we had with him a few years back, talking about lots of things like the World Football League, for example, which now resides, courtesy of Mr. Bell, thank you, kind sir, in the McCormick Collection. So as you're, going out there to do some research or whatever, feel free to enjoy that episode and perhaps a few others, maybe to be contributed. Maybe this one, for God's sakes. But who knows? But it's nice to know that at least a few people out there find some value in what we do and want to commemorate it and keep it around, so people can discover it, maybe learn from it, or put it into their works as they're feverishly going for their PhDs and whatnot. We appreciate that for sure. The book, however, in the interim, by Dr. Brian Bunk, is From Football to Soccer, the Early History of the Beautiful Game in the United States. It is published by the University of Illinois Press, Go Illini. And again, Chapter 5 is the chapter that you want to highlight, because that's the in-depth story of what we kind of just danced around in our conversation. Of these, yes, two, actually, which we didn't know going into this conversation, two professional soccer leagues in 1894, the American League of Professional Football and the American Association of Professional Football, with the baseball owners in the background, putting it all together. Fascinating stuff. Brian, let's see, can also be found on Twitter at Soccer History US and on the web at soccerhistoryusa.org. And interestingly, among other things, on soccerhistoryusa.org, you will find, believe it or not, an in-depth and only of its kind player database of all of the players that he has discovered in his research that played in both of these 1894 professional leagues. So talk about a genealogy project. It's there among many other cool things. And again, that website is soccerhistoryusa.org. All right, our website, while you're firing up your browser or your mobile device, is, of course, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where we store all of our episodes, in case you happen to miss a few, or you want to point people to, a little sampling, if you will, so that they can subscribe or follow in their various podcast feeds. We post every episode up there. That's always your backstop in case you miss them, or there's some kind of blow up of your phone and you miss out. And you can stream them, you can share them, and we of course put a little slideshow of relevant photos and links to the various books and stuff. That's all the sort of the convenient place. So if everything just goes to hell in a handbasket, just remember the website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's your locus for everything about this show. And there's a lot more to come. It's just, this is still a labor of love 4+ years into it. But there's lots of other things we want to sort of add into that. So keep checking, will you, on the site for more good stuff, and we'll certainly let you know. But our web site is certainly there. You can send us email if you'd like, hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. If you want to follow us on social media, you can follow us on Facebook. We're at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available as well. And on Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. And last but not least, while you're on the website, just tool around there and find I forget what button it's on. I'm sorry. It's already out of my mind. Is the email newsletter, he's trying to say, that we send out each and every week over the weekend, usually, to kind of give you a hint, a little taste of what the coming week's episode is all about and gonna be. So get into that list too. You'll be in the in crowd for sure. And of course, we bow our, how about our Brooklyn Bridegroom's cap in the general direction of the great Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. Thank you, kind sir, as always. And thank you, the great listeners. Thank you for all your input, your cards and letters and emails and social media tweets. And yeah, even you, Johnny Knucklehead. We love your attention to the show, and we appreciate your commentary wherever it may come from. Until next week, we'll see ya. Thanks for listening. Bye.